Not only do the sex programs encourage students to opt for lifestyles opposed to the traditional monogamous marriage with children, but they discredit the student's own parents' wisdom and authority, claiming to, quote, improve communication between parents and children, end quote. They encourage children to report their family problems, even asking children as young as age 6 if their parents molest them or are alcoholic. Young children and adolescents must divulge their grievances and feelings toward their families to their sex classes. The determined assault on the family serves the double purpose of lessening its attractiveness and discrediting its moral authority. The problem with families, really, is that they produce and nurture children. As Kingsley Davis puts it, quote, the parent-child bond is peculiarly close, end quote, and, quote, in having children, an individual is not only creating new human beings, but is also creating new and durable bonds for himself, end quote. The most effective way to limit the inconvenient desire of families for what Davis regards as an excessive number of children is to, quote, lessen the identity of children with parents, or lessen the likelihood that this identity will be satisfying, end quote. And he taps one of the best ways to accomplish this, quote, the school system, one of the main functions of which appears to be to alienate offspring from their parents, end quote. He also suggests that childbearing would be discouraged, quote, if males were relieved of responsibility for children and denied identification with them, for, without the daily assistance of a man, few women seem likely to bear and rear 2 or more children, end quote. Other impediments to births, according to Davis, are, quote, very high divorce rates, homosexuality, pornography, and free sexual unions, end quote. Davis sees additional hope in, quote, the child welfare services which have increasingly tended to displace the father as a necessary member of the family, and the health services which have increasingly flouted parental authority with respect to contraception and abortion, end quote. And he notes that these public services have the peculiarity of lessening the cost of children to their parents at the same time as they, quote, interpose other authorities between the parent and the child and thus dilute the parent-child identity, end quote. Clearly, to weaken or destroy the traditional family, which not only produces children but rivals the modern behemoth state as a source of support and authority for individuals, is to strengthen government population control. Calderon and Johnson can hopefully announce that because of the decline of the family, quote, we may be evolving into an age in which the individual will more and more replace the family as the basic unit of society, end quote. The thought invigorates the new sex educators in their unremitting efforts to stress the individual rather than the interpersonal nature of sexual activity. Burt and Meeks, for example, describe coitus briefly but dwell for pages on the, quote, 4 phases of sexual response, end quote, of the separate individuals. They liken sexual response to a person jumping off a diving board and suggest that junior high school teachers discuss in depth the person's singular, not the person's plural, feelings about sexual excitement and orgasm. In keeping with the focus on the isolated individual, masturbation is a highly recommended form of sexual expression. Most obviously, of course, as the sex educators readily admit, pregnancy is impossible, but masturbation has other benefits as well. Quote, sex is too important to glop up with sentiment, end quote, a Planned Parenthood pamphlet for teenagers advises. Quote, if you feel sexy, for heaven's sake, admit it to yourself. If the feeling and tension bother you, you can masturbate. Masturbation cannot hurt you, and it will make you feel more relaxed, end quote. The prominent sex educator Peter Scales agrees, quote, if we were a little more positive about masturbation, we would be helping a lot of people relieve sexual tension and get them away from going into sexual experiences that they really don't want to have and are not ready to handle, end quote. Not to be outdone, Calderon and Johnson teach that, quote, masturbation for release of tension and to experience pleasure occurs throughout the lives of most people with only positive effects, unless they are made to feel anxious or guilty about it, end quote. They recommend it for babies, children, young people, and adults well into old age, and, quote, sometimes in painful situations such as illness of the partner or separation by travel, death, or divorce, but usually as a part of ordinary life, end quote, and most emphatically, it is of great importance, quote, in developing a strong sense of the self, end quote. Since sex educators believe that little girls are less likely than little boys to discover their organs of pleasure spontaneously, they give special attention to little girls in locating the clitoris and castigate parents who withhold this essential information from their daughters. The stress on the self is carried out in the prevalent values clarification exercises. Quote, who are all those others and what are they doing in my life, end quote, queries Sidney Simon in his Meeting Yourself Halfway, 31 Values Clarification Strategies for Daily Living. A diagram portrays me at the center of the page, surrounded by parent, guardian, peer leader, important teacher, and others, parenthetically, but no brothers or sisters, end parenthetical. The importance of healthy self-concepts, self-esteem, and self-acceptance rules supreme. The self, as the locus of decision-making skills, receives concentrated attention. Children are taught that they must choose not only their own behavior, but their own values under the direction, of course, of their sex teachers. They encourage them at early ages to criticize their parents' standards as well as those taught by organized religion. The educators hammer away at standards of truth and goodness, insisting they are not constant and enduring, but must be revised by those who are, quote, up to date on important facts science has discovered, end quote. Calderon quotes Mesthine as saying, quote, change is the new reality, the unchanging is unreal, constraining, a false goal, end quote. Children must, quote, become familiar with change, feel comfortable with it, understand it, master it, and control it, end quote. Human standards, the human material itself, must be altered to accord with the changes in technology created by science, and it is the high duty and privilege of the scientifically trained sex educators as representatives of society's best minds to provide children and their parents with whatever up-to-date information they need to adjust their standards and values. A smooth transition in logic leads to the ordination of the sex educators as the new high priests of the new orthodoxy. No appeal to a higher law is possible for the masses, for there is no higher law than the most up-to-date facts announced by science. If today's announced facts differ from yesterday's, so much the worse for yesterday. Change is the only reality. Truth is what Calderon and Johnson say it is, quote, where religious laws or rules about sex were made on the basis of ignorance of facts now known, laws and rules need to be re-examined and recast to be consonant with these facts, end quote. And no one but those empowered to determine the latest facts will control this constant flux of change, regardless of Mesthine's optimistic statement. Neither children nor their parents will have control. Their duty is to comply with a canon over which they have no say whatsoever. The valuing process, with its elements of freely choosing, is in consequence not only allowed, but insisted upon by the new elite. The participants, armed with the appropriate facts and a list of selected choices by their leaders, can be trusted to arrive at the clear wisdom of the group as pre-designed by the authorities. And to make doubly sure there are no slip-ups, the values clarifying procedure makes its participants publicly affirm their beliefs and opinions without secret ballot, in full view of their peers and leaders. The denigration of traditional religion is of paramount importance in the plans of the new sex education population control establishment. All rival loyalties and authorities must be destroyed if the individual is to be liberated for his new role vis-a-vis the state and its ruling elites. One avenue of attack is to charge religion with fostering sexual dysfunction. The instructional materials ridicule Christian practices and ethics, portraying Christians as stupid, ignorant, bigoted, and of all things, of wearing funny shoes. Some far-sighted people, they are happy to report, no longer blindly follow the antediluvian teachings of the Catholic Church, but instead, quote, decide to follow their own consciences without asking the Church what to do, end quote. Children exposed to the values clarification exercises are asked if they would really want to, quote, go to heaven if it meant playing a harp all day, end quote, and, quote, how many of you would be upset if organized religion disappeared, end quote. They implant doubts by suggesting that religious ethics are riddled with insincerity. Quote, a man cheats on his income tax each year but donates all the money to his church, end quote. But they make exceptions. Those clerics and other churchmen who swim in apologies for the past repressive influence of the churches and join sex educators in their demands for reform are eagerly embraced and publicized by the movement. Their deathless sayings are reverently quoted. They become advisors and consultants to the entire network promoting sex education. Preoccupation with sex roles is the final most significant feature of the programs. To undermine or destroy the traditional family and replace it with a sense of self, a ploy to reduce birth rates and increase the influence of the state, boys and girls have to learn to reject their roles as future fathers and mothers. To this end, the programs urge young children to question their gender and to balk at the pressures and expectations placed upon them to fulfill their sex roles. They tell stories and show films about people who find supreme happiness in reversing their sex roles and extol famous people in history who have been homosexuals. The instruction stresses the normality of homosexuality and the abnormality of those who disapprove of it, dubbing them as having homophobia. The sex educators teach children the techniques of homosexual intercourse and how to come out if they suspect that they are homosexual. They emphasize that even in heterosexual marriage, roles are changing. Women choose careers and men become homemakers, and some people delay or entirely forego childbearing. In spite of all these efforts, an assessment of sex education in the 1990s concluded that, quote, unfortunately, heterosexual mechanics is most often presented, end quote. In rebuttal, a reviewer said, quote, certainly there are Planned Parenthood affiliates with a narrow view, but there are many who lead educational efforts aimed at reducing homophobia, end quote. There are indeed many, and there are many others active in the effort. The Bay Area Network of Gay and Lesbian Educators held a conference in 1996 at James Logan High School, a public high school in Union City, California, to discuss the homosexual agenda for the schools. The keynote speaker was Delane Easton, State Superintendent of Instruction, who stressed the need to support homosexual students, praised the support services for gay lesbian youth in San Francisco, and urged her listeners to do the same in their own schools. The president of the Alameda County Board of Supervisors, Gail Steele, denounced the prejudice and explosive rage against homosexuals and the need for breaking down the barriers. The conference presented an award to the Alameda County School Board for urging local schools to hold staff development workshops to address the needs of homosexual, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender students and staff. The conference presented another award to the Catholic Diocese of Oakland because 2 diocesan schools have established gay-straight alliances. Workshops discussed the problems and pleasures of cross-dressing, the difference and similarities between transvestites, transsexuals, and transgenders, how some teachers at San Leandro High School marched in the San Francisco Gay Pride Parade, and how you too can create change. Teachers sympathetic to the cause diagnosed children as young as age 9 as homosexual and offer them support as such. A video features interviews with, quote, gay, lesbian, and bisexual teens, their parents, and professional outreach workers, end quote. Ah, yes, those outreach workers, the, quote, sexual harassment, end quote, they endure, and their stress in coming out. The movement reaches beyond San Francisco and New York to farming areas such as Modesto, California, where the school board, under pressure from the Gay, Lesbian, Straight Teachers Alliance, adopted a tolerant school safety program, ostensibly to protect homosexual students and teachers from harassment. The school board sent teachers to the Union City Conference and approved a video narrated by the director of GLSTA, which discusses the, quote, prejudice bigotry against gay and lesbian people, end quote, and says, quote, do you ask your parents or family for help? In many cases, not if you're a smart kid, end quote. The Sex Information and Education Council of the United States, one of the principal promoters of school sex education, has a special place on its website for sexual orientation and identity, in which it proclaims that, quote, an individual's sexual orientation, whether bisexual, homosexual, or heterosexual, is an essential part of sexual health and personality, end quote, and defends, quote, the right of each individual to accept, acknowledge, and live in accordance with his or her orientation, end quote. It denounces homophobia as an irrational hatred and fear. In its statement about human sexuality, What Children Should Know, Planned Parenthood Federation of America insists that children of age 6 to 9 should be, quote, aware that sexual identity includes sexual orientation, lesbian, gay, straight, or bisexual, end quote. Encourage increased homosexuality is one of the measures to reduce U.S. fertility, recognized by Planned Parenthood since at least 1970, when it appeared on a list published by the organization.
The prisoner wishes to say a word.